Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the last show for this week. We've got lots more coming up for your enthusiasm, for your enthusiastic views, for your entertainment, for your Christmas viewing coming up over the next few weeks. But right now we are off to the Ardennes. Will Hogan returns to talk about his father's role in the Battle of the Bulge and the deeds of Task Force Hogan at Beffe-Marcouray on the 21st and 22nd December. His book, as last time, is in the links below. I'll bring him in now. Good afternoon, Will. How are you today?
Good afternoon, Paul. Thanks for having me. I'm doing great.
So the big news is, since you were last on, you've changed direction. You've grown a beard. So what have you been up to since last time you were on?
Yeah, last time we talked, it was around June, around D-Day anniversaries. Since that time, I finished my 20 plus years in the Army, so officially retired. And of course, I think it's mandatory. You got to try to grow a beard, right? So
yeah, well, it seems to be the thing. So, when you came on last time and you talked about Normandy, we were talking about the kind of the evolution of tank doctrine and tank infantry cooperation, and how as the battle proceeds in the ETO, things get better and better. And as we were saying last time, kind of by November, December, things are really coming together for the armored divisions, American and British in the ETO. They're kind of over the bumps of working things out, and then they get this, in a weird way, they get this chance to shine, albeit in a pretty fraught situation when the Germans counterattack. But it does offer this opportunity to show what they're made of. So we'll bring up your slides, and folks, fire away with questions and things for Will about this. But it's tactics, it's units, it's small unit action, large unit actions, and above all, it's Will talking about his father. So over to you, sir.
Thank you. So yeah, like you were mentioning, it's there was a lot of sentiment in the fall, right? Hey, on to Berlin, when they first broke through the Germans in France, and then on to Belgium, there was even a sentiment of home by Christmas, right? That was not to be the case. Past the Siegfried Line, they expended a lot of combat power, taking Stolberg and Aachen, preparing for the move to the Rhine, right? So that takes us to fall, late November. And the units, the most forward units, right? 1st Army, 3rd Armored Division, the 7th Corps have halted after taking Aachen. A lot of losses in men and equipment, unfortunately. So you got to build up combat power, right? So you got to wait for these personnel reinforcements. You got to wait for these tanks and supplies, right? The Armored Divisions ran on a ton of fuel, and the Shermans took 2 hours of maintenance for every hour rolling. So you can imagine, you have to take a tactical pause, and that's when Hitler's counteroffensive kicked off on 16 December. And the Germans had succeeded in hiding their preparations. They moved all this heavy equipment, several armored divisions, 200,000 men initially, up to 500,000 men by the end of the campaign. They moved them on roads covered with straw, absolute secrecy. So it took the Allies by complete surprise. Yep. So yeah, so looking at this slide, I think it kind of, this picture encapsulates the conditions, right? The worst winter in 100 years, snow, freezing conditions. You're talking about the Ardennes, right? The wooded area, hills, narrow country roads, little better than logging trails, really. So terrible terrain for tanks. And of course, here you see on the left a Panther tank, right? Main item of the German advance, and on the right of it a Sherman, and you can kind of see the disparity in the size and the armor and the armaments. But that was also going to be an Achilles heel for both, because you don't have bridges, you don't have large roads, there's no space to maneuver. So in the Ardennes, whatever unit could control river crossings, could control the high ground where you had these road intersections, was going to win the day. So it was an incredible campaign. So I guess we'll move on from this slide. Let's see. There we go. Okay, so I'm talking to you mostly about the northern shoulder of the Bulge, right? A lot of people are familiar with Bastogne, Band of Brothers, but the front was enormous, right? It's one of the largest, or the largest battle ever fought by the U.S. Army. By the end of the campaign, 500,000 troops, massive amount of casualties, and a huge battlefront. And so we're going to narrow it down to the northern shoulder. And we're talking about Task Force Hogan, right, which is a battalion of the 3rd Armored Division. Reinforced, this is what it normally looked like, right? 500 soldiers, 54 tanks, so 2 companies of Shermans and 1 of Stuart's, which was a very lightly armored fast, but really worthless against other German tanks. And it was a unit that could sustain itself for a while. It had its own cooks, its own mortars, its own maintenance section. So as long as you had a higher headquarters nearby, you could advance. They kept the supplies coming. You could keep the offensive going. So just a little bit, of course, about my dad. He was the youngest tank battalion commander that I found in World War II at 28 years old. West Pointer, and initially commissioned into the cavalry, right? He was a horse cavalryman for the first 3 years of his career. He was stationed down on the Rio Grande Valley with the 12th Cav, patrolling basically the border, right? And from there, World War II was looming, and he transferred to tanks. He was one of the founding members of the 3rd Armored Division. But again, this is, and I'll be giving this talk at NATO Historical Society in a couple of weeks, but it's really a story of leadership, resilience, overcoming odds, the weather. So we're going to look now at the chain of command, right? And this is where you're going to find it interesting, because we were talking about Montgomery earlier. This was the normal chain of command, right? Dwight D. Eisenhower at the top, 12th Army Group, Omar Bradley, great commander. Below him was 1st Army, Courtney Hodges, old World War I veteran, not a prima donna, not a headline hunter, a pretty competent guy, right? But kind of low key. So that's why you don't hear a lot about him in the history books. Below him, of course, Lightning Joe Collins. I think everybody knows about him a little bit. The 7th Corps, and then 3rd Armored Division. What's interesting about this, and why I have this picture up, if you see on the right, is Field Marshal Montgomery.
Yep.
And because the initial German attack was so deep, so lightning fast, it actually cleaved 1st Army from its higher headquarters, the 12th Army Group. So we'll see that during the middle of the battle, 3rd Armored Division was actually put under 21st Army Group and under Field Marshal Montgomery, because they were separated from their higher headquarters. And yeah, I love this picture because this was taken in England, and it shows Eisenhower, of course, on the left, Montgomery on the right, and that is one of the Task Force Hogan company commanders, Lieutenant at that time, later Captain John Barclay. And they're at a range in England, and obviously freezing conditions, and the guy's just the picture of professionalism, right? So he's one of the company commanders that went through the whole war. He got wounded several times. Let's see, so moving on. All right, let's get to the nuts and bolts, right? Battle of the Bulge. Like I mentioned, largest battle fought by the U.S. Army. And the Germans really threw everything but the kitchen sink. I mean, they were able to advance, and of course their objective was Antwerp, right? Cut the Allies in two, separate the British from the Americans. And if you capture Antwerp and the ability of the Allies to bring in all these supplies, right? Beans and bullets, and of course fuel, then that was going to halt the advance in the West. The Germans would have been able to move resources to the East and then sue for peace. And that was kind of the plan behind this gamble.
And yeah, but just to jump in quickly, Will, I mean, it is a gamble for the Germans, of course, but it's hitting the Allies when the Allies are still struggling with supplies. I mean, yes, they've kind of the Scheldt estuaries up and running now. They're getting stuff in from Antwerp, but they're still. It's a magnificently enormous Allied army, but it's kind of unwieldy. There's lots of moving parts to it. It's as James Holland says, we've got the restrictions of wealth, whereas the Germans have the freedom of poverty. It takes the Allies a long time to bring everything up because they've got all that strength in depth. They've got all the workshops and the airfield repairing units and all those kind of things there, where the Germans don't have that. So as you said, they were able to bring up their tanks kind of in the secret, but they don't have that strength in depth. They haven't got massive resources. So in a weird way, it's easier for them to move their force and get them ready, especially because they're only coming from Germany, really just a a few dozen miles to the east, whereas the Allies, as you said, every bullet and bandage that's got anywhere near the US front lines has come an awful long way by the December of 44.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And the Allied planners were anticipating all these river crossings,
Yep.
right? You had to get over the Rhine, you had to push into some of its tributaries, the Ruhr, the Erft, and all those require massive amounts of supplies, right? Pontoon bridges, anti-aircraft assets to protect the bridgehead, everything you can think of, cold weather uniforms. That's the other thing. You have the worst winter in 100 years coming up. So you have infantrymen that they're going to get frostbite. That can render your unit combat ineffective. If they start losing their toes, you're out of the fight, right? So that was very problematic for the Allies.
Yeah.
So clearly, I think Hitler saw this and he said, if we could take Antwerp, that'll buy us time, and we can actually sue for peace, get some sort of arrangement out of this. So at that time, 19 December. Between 16 and 19 December, initial attack began on 16 December, massive artillery barrage into a line that was held by 4 understrength or brand new divisions, right? One of them, the 106th Infantry Division, Golden Line's newest division in the Army, right? They're numbered from the 1st Infantry Division starting in World War I all the way to the 106th, which had just arrived into Europe, I think in early December. Yep. And were thrown into the line. So you have a situation where about 200,000 German troops smashed into this line of about 80,000 and achieved complete surprise. It became a situation of chaos where the Allies didn't know, okay, we're receiving reports of an attack. Units are getting overrun. Radio lines are getting cut. So Eisenhower down to Hodges were in the dark. At this time, 3rd Armored Division was in Germany. After much hard work, they'd taken Stolberg, and they were preparing to move on to the Rhine. And the only units that were not committed in 1st Army was 1 command of the 3rd Armored Division, the CCR, Combat Command Reserve, and the 82nd Airborne. So those are the only units that General Hodges was able to say, hey, gentlemen, start your engines. You're pulling back to Belgium to stop what looks like a massive German counteroffensive. So at that point, about 19 December is when they were able to, get rolling, and Task Force Hogan began turning around, and they did not have their full strength of tanks, right? Because 1 tank company got assigned to one of the other task forces. The light tanks were sent to the rear to protect, Eisenhower's headquarters. There were rumors of Germans dressed in American uniforms, German paratroopers jumping in to assassinate Eisenhower. I mean, it was chaos, and nobody knew what was what and what was rumors. So this is a great map because it just shows, all the way up north, you have Aachen, yep. And the staging areas where 3rd Armored Division was, right? And you move south towards the center of the map is where the main penetration was, the main effort, Panzer Corps under Manteuffel. And they just start hell-bent for leather going west, right? And then if you see that blue arrow up there is the 7th Corps coming back from Germany with the objective of Houffalize to kind of stabilize the line and, hold the Germans back. And now going back to Task Force Hogan, you saw the original Task Org. Now we're down to 1 company of tanks, right? H Company has been detached to Task Force Or, which was an infantry heavy battalion. They did not have tanks. So we lose an entire company of Shermans. Charlie Company and 3 stewards, again, sent to guard rear area headquarters to look for paratroopers, supposedly sent to assassinate Eisenhower. So what do? You go with what you have, right? And sometimes I've looked at this and I've said, gosh, they must have known it was like a speed bump or almost like a suicide mission, right? Just go slow them down as much as you can, meeting to contact, and you may or may not come back, truthfully. So from here, Colonel Howes was the Combat Command Reserve commander, right? And he knew that you're sending understrength tank battalions into this maelstrom We have no idea what the German strengths are. So they actually plussed Task Force Hogan up. They got one platoon from the 83rd Recon Battalion, M8 Greyhounds, which you see here.
Yep.
It's basically a scout car, fast, lightly armored, but it's a little more firepower, right? And it lets you use them as a screen so you can move out, find the enemy, and then engage. Because at this point, nobody knew how far they'd advanced. Units are getting overrun, cut off. The Allies really didn't know where the front line started there at the Ardennes between 16 to 19 December. So in addition to this, they gave them a Alpha Battery 54th Field Artillery Battalion, so self-propelled 105 millimeter howitzers, good for indirect fire. In a pinch, you could shoot them as a direct fire anti-tank weapon, but clearly they don't have the optics, they don't have the kind of round that's designed to take out other tanks. And then finally, a section of anti-aircraft half-tracks, which we'll see in the next slide from the 486th anti-aircraft. They called themselves the anti-anything battalion because they were used, to shoot up tanks, bunkers, anything.
Yeah, river crossings, everything. The notion of them pointing skywards had kind of been forgotten about since Normandy. They were a massive asset for the U.S. Army in the ETO, the anti-aircraft battalions, and don't get enough talked about enough, I don't think.
Yeah, and that brings us to a good point too. You see the clouds up ahead was the worst winter in 100 years, which effectively grounded U.S. air power and negated that big advantage we had, right? Which was those P-47s, fighter bombers that could take out the German columns. So really, if you think about it, these and you see one on the right, 4 50 caliber machine guns mounted on the back of a half track. They don't have any Luftwaffe to shoot down, so you use them in a direct fire role. And very good at suppressing enemy, clearing out infantry, but clearly against a Panther, against a Tiger, it's not going to do you much good. And then on the left, you see one of the M7 priests, right, that was abandoned after the fight. So you get an idea what the equipment was.
And it's interesting that at this point, as you were saying, that the Allies have got a little bit complacent about they're the ones dictating the plays. Pretty much since Operation Torch, it's the Allies are the aggressors, the Allies are launching their operations, and the Germans are reacting to it. And obviously there've been counterattacks from the Germans along the way, of course. But this is now the first time, really, for a couple of years, where the Allies are scrambling around against a major German offensive. And it's the complacency, I think, is the word that always kind of comes into mind when you think of those first few days. Allies that have got used to ultra, as you said, they got used to having air power, plentiful air power, and then suddenly bad weather, something happens, and just gaining information becomes the first thing to do before you actually can put together a plan of what to do about it. Is find out, as you said, exactly who's coming, where are they coming, what they try to do, and in what strength.
Exactly right, and that reminds me of something where General Hodges, First Army commander, was known as a reliable, no nonsense. He knew his doctrine, but he basically, I've read several accounts where he kind of lost it during this battle. His staff had to basically put him in a Dodge command car and send him to the rear, and they went way back. They went all the way to Spa because they, for all they knew, the Germans were on their way to Antwerp. So First Army kind of became ineffective there for about the first 48, 72 hours. Eventually they came around, but the shock was, like you say, it was that big that it affected the First Army commanders.
And as a veteran yourself, do you think the relative inexperience of units like the 106th and things would have compounded that sense of not knowing what to do? Had there been a few more reliable, veteran units in the front line, they may have been a bit more savvy, taken stock a bit quicker and realized what was going on. But you add these new people in the line and it doesn't, and then the fear of the Germans, as you say, dressed as American MPs, things like that. There was quite a lot of, I don't want to use the word panic, but it's getting towards panic, isn't it, amongst certain quarters in the early stages?
There was definitely some panic there. A couple of regiments of the 106 just got either destroyed or all taken prisoner, right? At least 2 regiments of the 106. The 99th, they had to pull back, and I think they were spread thin, right? They were new units,
Yeah.
but if they had had the right ratio of combat power, they might have been able to hold off a little better. But I think it was like one crew per 3 kilometers or something. It was like bare minimum.
It was very thin, wasn't it? I mean, again,
Yeah.
it's the complacency. Everyone's thinking, well, it's Christmas soon, nothing's going to be happening, and boy, did it happen.
Yeah, exactly. It was a mixture of hey, the Germans have been licked. We just got to build up combat power under Berlin, and also we'd already underestimated the Ardennes twice before. You know, in 1940, that's the route the Germans took to outflank the Maginot Line, and it was also part of the Schlieffen Plan in World War I. So the Ardennes was routinely underestimated as an avenue of approach for invading armies.
Definitely.
So moving on, we'll take you to a little bit of the timeline, right? Because it's so chaotic. I wanted to put a timeline. 16 December is the initial German assault, right? Chaos. I think they were already on the 17th getting reports all the way in Stolberg about paratroopers landing, about artillery duels. It looked like a major offensive was happening. By 19 December, they actually got alerted by First Army. They said, 3rd Armored Division, 1 command, right? The other units were engaged. You're going back to Belgium, objective Houffalize, and meeting engagement, right? Find the enemy and then hold them. My father wrote about doing an all-night tactical road march, right, in the vehicles, and they literally could see the V2 rockets flying overhead on the way to Antwerp. And they just sounded like you would think of a cruise missile, right? A little slower with this kind of womp, 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 womp drone flying overhead. And at that time, you know, this is a new weapon. You didn't know if it was just going to come crashing down on your column or what the deal was. So I definitely added to the angst and the uncertainty.
Yep.
And my father also mentioned they had zero knowledge of enemy strength, intentions, or anything. They just said, look, your objective is Houffalize. You're going to encounter the Germans on the way. That's all we could tell you. So, yeah, after an all-night tactical march, they arrived at La Roche. La Roche-en-Ardenne is a rocky outcrop town by the Ourthe River, where they encountered the remnants of the 9th Armored Division, right, the trains. The 9th Armored Division was one of the units that was holding that line. They'd been chopped to pieces in previous battles, so they were under strength. At that point, my father said, we're going to hold here, and we're going to push out recon elements to find the enemy, and then we'll fix them and fight them. Unfortunately, the morning of the 22nd, my dad went out in 2 Jeeps with his command group to meet the next door unit, right, the unit next to him, the 83rd Recon Battalion, and immediately encountered a roadblock. It looked like GIs. They were on half tracks, dressed, you know, in the big olive drab overcoats, with a couple of German prisoners, and they were all eating rations. All of a sudden, you know, the U.S. 2 Jeeps, they screeched to a halt. And my dad's driver looks at my dad and goes, "They're German, sir." And right about that time, they start picking up their weapons, these Americans, and start firing at my dad's little convoy. They didn't have time to turn around. Again, narrow country roads, freezing temperatures, right? So one of the vehicles stalled, and they had to run out through the woods and escape either getting taken prisoner or getting shot. So this starts off terribly, right, for the Americans, for Task Force Hogan. Commander, operations officer have been separated from the main body and are out in the woods, basically lost. So during this time, the main body was already encountering attacks there at La Roche, and they received an order from Colonel Howes, Combat Command Reserve, to pull back to Beth, right, to a better fortified position. Because if you look at La Roche-en-Ardenne, it's a town, but it's overlooked by high ground. And the Germans already had infantry, and they were rolling down grenades, they were firing rockets, so you would never be able to hold La Roche. So they pulled back to Beth, and my dad basically spent the next 24 hours exfiltrating through the woods, spent the night freezing cold, and we were able to find the main body, which by this time was in Marcory and was already surrounded. Right? And that was the thing, is you have a tank unit with no infantry to support. So the Germans had an infantry division in the area, the Volksgrenadier unit, So with infantry, you can just walk in the woods and surround these tank units that really can't maneuver. And these infantry are armed with Panzerfaust rockets that can easily take out a Sherman, especially at the close ranges we're dealing with there in the woods. So 23 December, they've reached a good hilltop position where they can hold the Germans. They can call artillery on them. They're starting to run out of fuel and ammunition, right? They went in, by the time they got to La Roche, they had tanks half full for their vehicles. So already, they can maybe maneuver a little bit, but if you run out of fuel and you're not on a hilltop, you're dead.
Because the assets an armored column like this has is maneuverability, fuel, and plenty of ammunition. With those, and if you can choose the ground, that's a bonus as well. But the more you're being restricted, the more you think, well, we can't even run around much because we're going to run out of gasoline. It's putting in a very, very tough situation. It's this is what we should be putting the Germans in. At this point of the war, this is exactly the situation we should be putting the Germans in. And indeed, we had been back in September and October, despite some of the toughness of the battles. That's what the Allies were doing to the German units. And now the tables have turned.
Exactly. And my dad made the calculus. They took all the vehicles and said, we have maybe 5 or 6 miles we can maneuver, but if we get caught in low ground, we're screwed. If we get caught in low ground, we can't communicate, right? You're talking about very hilly terrain. The only way you're going to be able to get a radio transmission to higher headquarters is if you're on a hilltop. So that's what they were able to find at this village of Marcouray. It was a little stone farming village, made up of woodcutters. Most of the men had evacuated or had been drafted or were serving in the resistance, right, in the Belgian resistance. We're talking about population 120. But they're very well-built stone houses, and they overlook one of these key crossroads, right? So from there, they fortified, and they began using these M7 priests, artillery howitzers, to fire on the Germans as they began streaming around them to their objective, to Antwerp. So this definitely slowed the Germans down. But again, by 24 December, ammunition, especially fuel, was out. They had taken about a dozen wounded. There was an ambush outside La Roche on the recon element, and they had about a dozen wounded. So they were in dire need of plasma. And we got to give credit to the Allies, right? They made every effort to resupply by air. They sent C-47s, which the ones that didn't get shot down were able to drop their loads, but they drifted into German lines, right? It was almost like you gave the Germans a Christmas present of fuel and rations. Additionally, La Roche had been occupied by the Panzer Corps headquarters, so it was covered with anti-aircraft defenses. The second thing they tried is they took the 54th Artillery Battalion that was about 15 miles to the rear, 15 kilometers to the rear, and they had these 105 millimeter shells that were used to shoot propaganda leaflets. Some logistician quite astutely said, let's fill this with plasma instead of leaflets, and let's try to shoot them into the U.S. lines. My father's battalion surgeon, Doc Spiegelman, he did wonders with the wounded he had, but he was short supplies. Unfortunately, when they shot these artillery rounds, the G-forces of getting these rounds all the way out ended up being that the plasma was just gelled and destroyed by the time it hit the ground. Right? So aerial resupply was a failure.
Well, and at this point, how much information is your father getting about other units in the proximity? I mean, we can now look at maps and say, okay, this unit was here, this cav recon unit is here, this. But at the time, I mean, as each day went past, there must have been a limited amount of the bigger picture available to him.
That's correct. I mean, there were 3 task forces in Combat Command Reserve. There's Task Force Orr, Task Force Kane. My dad was the furthest one to the right with the Orta River protecting his flank. Now, if you got to a hilltop, you could get radio transmissions, if not to the other task forces, to the Combat Command Reserve, which was in Spa, about 12 miles away. But as soon as you dipped down to that high ground, you lost radio communication. And there was obviously no wire. Once they got surrounded, you weren't going to be able to get any couriers through. So it was also a lesson. Part of leadership is ability to act independently, right? we call it a mission command in the Army. You know what the commander's intent is, so you can follow through the mission, even if your commander gets killed, even if you get separated, even if you don't have communications. And that's something the U.S. Army's always used to their benefit is that concept, right? Responsibility down to the lowest level. So the two units that Task Force Hogan was up against was the 116th Panzer, the Greyhounds, right? They were known for their speed, their stopping power, and the infantry that I mentioned, the 352nd Volksgrenadier. Again, some units, the 352nd Volksgrenadier was a unit made up of conscripts, older people, youngsters, but armed with rockets and these STG-44 assault guns. They could be pretty dangerous. You can see the conditions here. This is Task Force Hogan tanks moving through these wooded areas, right? And as you can see, the wood line is less than 25 meters away, so easily within range of a Panzerfaust that could take out your tank. So this whole time, 24 December, the task force continued to fire artillery at the Germans as they were passing. There was even a case where they hit a staff car, a Kubelwagen, and the Germans kept trying to go to retrieve whatever was in it. I don't know if it was a code machine or maps, and every time they got near it, my dad's artillery liaison kept firing raining steel on them, and until they destroyed the Kubelwagen and whatever was in it. So then that takes us to 24 December, which in case, instead of Jolly St. Nick, a German officer came up in another staff car and demanded surrender, right? He arrived at one of the checkpoints that my dad had set up, a Sherman tank, manned by Clem Elizondo, his trusty sergeant/gunner, who radioed back and said, "Sir, you're not going to believe it. There's a German officer here with a white flag and wants to be taken to you." My dad said, "All right, blindfold him. We don't want him to be able to, call in artillery on where the headquarters is." So they drove him up blindfolded, and they demanded a surrender. And my father said, "Nope, we're not nuts." He wasn't as succinct as McAuliffe, but he said, "We're soldiers, and as soldiers, we're going to do our duty. I've been ordered to fight to the death, and that's what we'll do." Right. And at that time, there's the anecdote where he was a chain smoker, right? He loved his Camels, and to calm his nerves, but also show him, hey, we have plenty of supplies. He kept lighting cigarettes, offered the Germans some cigarettes, told them, "Nope, we're not surrendering. Get back to your unit," and that was it.
Something I want to ask you, Will, is in that situation when your father, when there were in a sense no cards left to play, you're surrounded, you don't know when help is coming. There are Germans all around you. Does it, in a weird way, not make your job easier, but there aren't any decisions that you just got to keep on fighting. It's kind of basic soldiery at that point. You haven't got to consider which way do we go, and you're looking at the map, you're getting all the different advice from all your different staff officers. It's just kind of backs against the wall and not enjoy it. But I've spoken to veterans myself. I said that actually in those situations, it becomes quite freeing. Would your father kind of agree with me, or would you think I was talking nonsense?
No, that's a great question. And to your point, the 3rd Armored Division was such an elite unit. They'd been in the toughest battles, always at the tip of the spear, right? Hence the name. They had really gelled together, and they trusted their commanders. They trusted their subordinates. I think my dad said, "You know what, General Rose is going to get us out of here." And all the way down to the rank and file, they felt it, because I believe it was on the 23rd, a couple of the crews of the C-47s that had gotten shot down parachuted close enough to walk into the Task Force Hogan perimeter. And one of the pilots or crew members was interviewed in the Stars and Stripes and said, "Yeah, these soldiers, they were bedraggled. They looked tired, but they were confident. They had confidence that the old man was going to get them out." But then again, my dad was a Texan, descended from pioneers, from lawmen, so he was familiar with the Alamo, right? And I think the thought probably crossed his mind. It was like, this could be our Alamo.
Yeah. Well, that was John McManus's book, was it? Alamo and the Ardennes. I mean, it gets to that point there. And I was going to ask you earlier on about, or reference the fact that the German morale starts pretty good on those first couple of days, because they've been promised this is going to change the course of the war. We're going to do this. But they know long term this is against the run of play. They know they've been suffering defeat after defeat since Joe. I would imagine you get to the kind of 21st, 22nd, 23rd, that their morale is on the brink of kind of falling apart, because they would be more aware that their advances aren't going with the speed they're meant to be. They would be aware of the fact that they've been halted in various places. So I suppose you get to that point where, as you said, the Americans just will believe that there's complete confidence there is help coming, and the Germans kind of falling into this idea, well, we've been in this situation before, no help has ever come for us. They, in their situation, help doesn't come. So I suppose there is a point where the battle would be ebbing in favor of the Allies.
Yeah, the accounts are that the initial advance was so fast and they sliced through the initial thin line so quickly that, yeah, the Germans were like, hey, this feels like we're on to Paris again.
Yeah, it feels like Blitzkrieg for 24 hours or so, yeah.
Exactly, 1940. But then you had these small, isolated, stubborn units that said, you know what, I have this little crossroads and they're not pushing me off. And there's a lot of stories like that, right? I mean, everybody knows Bastogne, but my father's mortars, and you saw it on the previous side, he actually left them in Hotton, which is another town up the road where there's a crossing of the river. And the mortars actually fought like heck along with the 23rd Engineers against the probe by Panther tanks, but they were able to prevent them from crossing the bridge. So it was all these small actions where tenacious U.S. and British troops just held the ground and foiled the German plans. So again, the situation's getting dire, right? 24 December, the Germans are still streaming by, and at some point, they have this thorn in their side, which is this little unit on a hilltop calling artillery on them. The surrender ultimatum has been declined. So at that point, I think they were thinking, look, the Germans are going to just like plow through us. And in fact, I believe it was on the 24th, two German 8-wheeled armored cars rolled into the perimeter. My dad said that's one of the worst things to happen to you before breakfast. He was stepping out of this building you see here, which the cellar of which was his command post. And he said two German 8-wheeled armored cars, reconnaissance cars, loaded with infantry, just zipped by right in front of him. He went back in, called the tank that was up there guarding the entrance, and the guy's turret had frozen overnight. Right, you can't traverse a turret with soldiers in there overnight. There was condensation, and it froze the turret solid. They could not turn it and shoot at these cars. So anyway, now you have enemies on the wire, right? And long story short, the German armored cars made it to the other end where there was a tank waiting for them, and they lit them up. And now, of course, on top of 13 wounded, you have a handful of German prisoners, including some dead, right? So if the Germans take the town, they're going to be like, oh, you shot these Germans, we're going to kill you. So the stakes keep getting higher.
Wow.
And here you have a picture of the command post, right? After the battle, after the Germans had, the Americans had retaken it, you see all the ammunition strewn about. You see the state of it's a sturdy stone house, but it's just been bombed to heck, right? Thankfully, a lot of the American soldiers and different CPs were in the cellars and were able to withstand the bombardment. And thankfully, also the civilians, right? Those that didn't evacuate were in the cellars right there with the Americans. And that was another consideration, right? If you have a battle for the town, it's going to be murder, and civilians are going to get killed in the crossfire. So again, the stakes were very, very high. So it takes us to Christmas Day, right? When they finally, communications were pretty sporadic, right? Because of the terrain, it's all by radio. General Rose sent a message basically saying, look, all units are tasked to relieve the 101st. Nobody's coming for you, right? So what I want you to do is destroy your equipment, any heavy equipment, anything you can't carry with you, destroy it, make it unusable, and make your way back as best you can. So they took Christmas Day they poured sugar into the gas tanks of the few vehicles they had left, ran them till they seized up. Of course, you could think, why don't you just blow them up with grenades? Why don't you just set it on fire? But that would have alerted the Germans. Say, hey,
yeah, of course,
these guys are prepping, right? For artillery pieces, they took out the breech blocks, right, the back part that closes behind the round, and threw them down wells or buried them. And they prepared the wounded to move out, those that could walk.
Now, how would your father have issued those orders? Because you've been holding on with your men for what's it been, a week now, essentially, and now no soldier likes pulling back, no matter whatever the reason, no matter whether the order has come from the a FDR himself. No one wants to go backwards. So how, as a commander, do you manage to convey that to your men that this is the right thing to do? Because abandoning equipment, putting sugar. I mean, and on the one hand, they've kind of got the relief that there is a plan for them. There is pull back. There's a line to go back to. But how do you deal with man management in that situation?
Exactly, it's a leadership challenge that went all the way back to Germany, right? When they were told, "Hey, you're pulling back to Belgium," they must have thought, "Oh heck, we're going to have to reconquer this ground that we've already paid dearly for." We're driving all the way back into Belgium, which we already liberated, right? 3rd Armored Division liberated Liège, liberated all those towns right in front of the Ardennes. So it's a leadership thing, and you can really see it in the conditions, right? The coldest winter in 100 years, machines don't operate. You touch the side of the tank and you get frostbite. Any food you have that's remotely warm, as soon as you put it on that metal plate, it turns into cold gelatinous mass, right? And you're short on supplies. So it was leadership, and I think the unit had gelled so well together and had such good confidence in their leaders that they're like, you know what, they know what we're doing. We're just going to pull back to where we can get new tanks, and then we're going to push on.
Okay, good response. Thank you.
You're welcome. So it took a while to get prepped, right? They took the rest of the daylight hours, and then scouts were going to lead small groups of 10, right? You're just going to send out a group of 10, wait 2 to 3 minutes, send out another group, and this long column of 400 soldiers through the middle of the woods. Obviously, no flashlights, nothing of the sort. Just navigating with a compass and the stars, if you can see any. Right, it's still a little bit overcast. There was a light coat of snow that fell on the 24th, but it started to clear up. Right, so thankfully there was some ambient light. So from there, they started. And it was a 12-mile march through enemy territory, and all soldiers made it back. I think it was a Christmas miracle, whether you believe in that or not. Getting 400 soldiers through enemy lines, through the woods in the middle of winter at night, I think was incredible. Lost only one soldier, was wounded in the thigh by a trigger-happy GI at the friendly lines, right? And here you see this picture of the soldiers at this compound in Sois, Belgium, where the Combat Command Reserve and the trains were getting their first meal right after coming back. So you can see the smiles. Their faces are camouflaged. They took axle grease to kind of camouflage up. And you can just see the relief, right? And this was big news. It got picked up by the AP, the Stars and Stripes, and it was just a really big morale building. At this time, the 101st was still surrounded, right? So this was an important morale building that, hey, we're going to keep fighting and we're going to do what we have to. And one story I wanted to highlight was one of the lead scouts, or probably the lead scout, was this Staff Sergeant Lee Porter, who grew up in Missouri, Great Depression, lost his parents. So how did he put food on the table? He was a hunter and a fisherman. So never better a scout for this mission, right? Somebody that knew the woods, somebody that could move cat-like through these dense forests at night. And he was in the lead. And about 3 a.m., they came to a German picket. And the German sentry was like, halt, halt, where are you going? Ask for a password. And everybody just froze. And Staff Sergeant Porter didn't miss a beat, ran around and sunk his bayonet into the sentry's throat, lowered him to the ground without a sound, and motioned the column to keep going. So that's one of the stories you never hear about. And during my research and my Belgian friends there with these groups, found out the story. And on the right, you see a picture after the war, Sergeant Porter receiving the British Military Medal from Montgomery himself. Because he saved the day. He saved the column from getting discovered. I mean, there would have been a big shootout in the forest, and they would have probably all been killed or captured at that point.
I'd love to know how Montgomery heard about that and how that ends up being a British decoration. That'd be a fantastic paper trail to discover.
Absolutely, yeah. And my Belgian friend Francois, he actually went to visit the family, the Porter family. He got a picture of the medal. I mean, that's a whole other book in itself, you know. And again, it was because the Germans had cleaved the units. Third Armored Division was separated from Bradley, so now they were under Montgomery, which is why at some point, you know, somebody put him in for a medal, and it went to Montgomery because he was in command at the time.
Yeah, brilliant stuff.
Indeed. And then, you know, this is pretty much the last slide, but it's from a combat camera video that was taken once they came out at the farm in Soie. And the famous story is that on the right is 3rd Armored Division Commander Major General Maurice Rose. And on the left is my dad, you know, after marching all night, camouflaged, probably had been freezing. And the story goes that General Rose said, "Colonel Hogan, I heard you were the last man out. Why was that?" And my father thought a minute. He said, "Oh, should I say something heroic?" And he said, "No, I'm going to stick to the truth." And he just said, "Sir, my feet hurt." Right. So I think it got captured here a little bit on the right when he's about to pat him in the back. But yeah, my dad had really bad flat feet, and he had these RAF fleece line boots that he had, and it just didn't work for marching through the woods. And so, but he crawled back and rejoined his unit, and there we were. And of course, so Task Force Hogan then got told, General Rose in this conversation said, "Look, you're going to get all your equipment back, and then you're going back into action, right? You can't spare a tank battalion in a situation like this." So 3 January, Task Force Hogan got fully refitted and went back in the action for the counteroffensive, right? Because the Battle of the Bulge did not end for another 3 weeks.
Yeah.
25 January is when we were able to push the line back to its starting point when the Germans crossed. And
I think that's key, is that, you know, in this, what would the expression be, you know, get straight back on the horse. You know, though there's been this successful withdrawal, you don't want everybody to start thinking that that's the norm and that this is what we're going to do for the rest of the war now. Is you want to get them straight back in and say, right, we've had a setback. Now we're on the offensive again. Let's forget the last 2 weeks happened, in a sense. We're back on our front foot again. We're on our way to Germany. Let's get to Berlin and end this war, because otherwise that kind of fall back is the sort of thing that could fester, isn't it? You know, and you know, this isn't, you're not going to win the war by falling back. As heroic as it was, as brilliant as it was, they got back there. This has to be righted, in a sense, and get back on with the plan of defeating Hitler and bringing the war to an end.
I think that was the attitude, right? When they were sitting there waiting for their equipment, you know, New Year's came along, and they're like, "We want to go get some payback for the soldiers we lost." But they were going to see some hard fighting, because the SS units that came in to kind of hold the Bulge, they put up a hard fight, and my father lost several tank crews to that action after, you know, well into January. So it continued, and Task Force Hogan, 3rd Armored Division, all the Allies would fight on another 4 months. You know, you still have major battles ahead, closing of the Ruhr, Paderborn, the SS Tank School, right? The 3rd Armored Division fought. So after this ordeal, they still had a lot of fighting to go. So it really, again, goes to their training, their leadership, their courage, which I sit in awe of, you know, looking back 80 years ago. To what they were able to accomplish.
Well, it's sort of unfortunate that we don't, although there is a nominal date for the end of the Ardennes campaign, and you know, certainly with the allocation of medals, you then get to the Rhineland campaign, I think, is it? But really, it just morphs. It starts off as a German offensive that becomes a German reaction, an American or an Allied reaction to an offensive operation, and then, as you said, it becomes an offensive operation, and it gradually becomes the attack into Germany. But there's no real date where suddenly it changed. It's a gradual process. And Peter Caddick Adams, you know, talks about the fact that he thinks that the day the end of the Ardennes was set was they got to the end of the war and they measured back 100 days from VE Day and kind of said, well, we'll make that day the end of the Battle of the Bulge. But depending on what unit you were in, it can be kind of early January, late January, February. It depends what your unit is doing, but it just morphs into another campaign, really, which is interesting for historians because it doesn't have that neat wrapped up ending that we like to define books.
Absolutely. Yeah, it kept going on all the way to the end of the war, all the way to the Elbe. So, yeah. And this slide here is just the reenactment, right? They've been doing it for the past couple of years. They're doing it this year for the 80th, and it's this Belgian group of young people, right? They're the ones that sponsor graves at Henri Chapelle and some of the national cemeteries, and it's wonderful to see these 30-year-olds, 20-year-olds kind of keeping the memory alive, and then they give presentations to middle school kids, so it kind of keeps the remembrance going. So I really like that. And this was a couple of years ago. We had my family there, over 100 reenactors, and this is the actual farm where they came out at, right? We saw that picture of them smiling.
Brilliant. Yeah,
it's the exact same compound, right?
And that's, of course, how people can find. The link is in the description as well, folks. So, well, brilliant stuff, Will. We've got a few questions that have been answered as we go along. There's a few that are kind of built up. So, and some of them are comments as well. So the Great Domin is saying, the Ardennes is obviously a forward area. I've never understood why it was chosen as an area to break in new units without combat sprints. And that is the interesting situation. You talked about it yourself, that the 106, and there are other units that ended up being there. And the veteran units that have been in the line, some of them since kind of North Africa, if you think of the 1st Division, things like that, it does seem, with hindsight, an odd place to kind of put people. But as you said, the mistake of not anticipating advance through the Ardennes had been made before, and it was made again. So I guess that's it. It comes back to that complacency, I suppose, really, doesn't it? Is that your take?
Yeah, that would be my take. I think we thought that the Germans kept a thin line there, so obviously we're going to keep a thin line there. I mean, the Germans were very overstretched fighting in Russia, holding this also large front in the west. And so the Ardennes was viewed as an area to get over the jitters for the green troops, let these other units that have been in contact rest. You know, it's wooded, it's quiet. But again, we underestimated, we didn't learn from history, right, that was a historic invasion run.
Yep, and as Mad Cat is saying, I think the lack of experienced German infantry divisions hurt the Germans more than anything. Most German divisions at that point had badly trained replacements, and that, I guess, is part of the reason why their offensive runs out of steam. It's two things: it's these valiant defenses of crossroads and bridges, things like that we've talked about on the channel, and you've talked about today, but also the fact that the Germans themselves just haven't got the strength in depth and the experience, and their units are of a mixed quality, just like some of the Allied units are of mixed quality. So that's worth saying. But the question I really want to ask you from Susan is saying, did Will base his talk on his father's papers, personal and official, and does Will have interviews with his dad? So how have you put this together? Well, I think we talked about that last time. Obviously, there's the official, there's the morning reports and the after action reports. But how do you put these presentations together?
So similar to other members of the Great Generation, my father really didn't like to relive the memories or talk about it. I think he had a little bit of survivor's guilt. But every now and then I would hear anecdotes, right? And the Battle of the Bulge was the best known one because Christmas would come along. He was always a loving guy. Never had a mean-spirited word for anybody, never raised his voice, but he would get a little quiet during Christmas, right? Because I think he would remember how it was cold, it was miserable, no idea if they were going to make it out alive. But from that, he wrote a short story about his experience, so that informed a lot of my writing. It's on the 3rd Armored Division Association papers and website, where he talks about encountering the column of Germans dressed as Americans, that kind of thing. And that's something we'd occasionally heard among the family members, right? Not in a lot of detail, but I think sometimes over a meal or something, one of his friends, maybe a fellow veteran, could get some of these anecdotes out of him.
And I guess you as yourself as a soldier, it's fair to say that you learn more when things are going badly for your improvement as an officer than you do when things are going well. It's in adversity where the things are tested and the procedures, the doctrine, the organization is put to the test. And I suppose not I suppose, and your father comes through this ordeal with going in, as you said there, with no information about the enemy's strength, no idea about where they're going to be and what they're going to be doing. You've got half of your force available to you, but that's when you discover what works and what doesn't work. So do you think that in those last few months, as they push up to the end of the war, this experience would have in a weird way benefited the forces under your dad's command?
I think so. I mean, an army, especially the U.S. Army, prides itself on being a learning organization. Right? We always do after-action reports. We always try to learn, especially if things went poorly. Unfortunately, because they had such a high tempo of combat, I don't think they had time to digest things slowly. They had to basically learn on the fly, and they did, of course, all the way from Normandy, right? When they learned, hey, never attack a Panther head on. You got to flank them. So they had to absorb things quickly and be resilient, right? That's one of the themes I've seen is resilience, leadership, and that's what got them through all these hard fights.
And David Levine is asking about a question for William: when time permits, did Colonel Hogan mention any particular junior officers and NCOs that helped him during this difficult time? Because we're talking about commanders, but we all know the backbone of a unit is your non-coms, it's your veteran sergeants and corporals. And so, you said he didn't talk about it much after war, but in your research and looking for, are there some key members of his team that were important during this time?
Absolutely, and I write from my father's perspective, but in Task Force Hogan, you'll get to meet the whole cast of characters. There was a Sergeant Grimes, who was the mortar, basically section leader, right, who kept the fires going. They beat off an attack from a Panther, basically just with mortars and help from the engineers. My father's loyal, basically Sergeant Major, right, Phil DiOrio, Staff Sergeant, who refused to leave my dad when his feet gave out, right, at 3 a.m. in the middle of the Ardennes. My dad was like, just keep going, and they refused to leave him. And this Sergeant Shorty Wright, who was the artillery liaison, who kept calling artillery on the Germans, and of course Staff Sergeant Porter, right, the head of the scouts, who led the way. He said, all right, we're going this way according to this map, follow me. And he took out that German sentry, which we'd be writing this as an epitaph more than a history of success if it wasn't for him. So absolutely.
Thanks for sharing that. And I think the last thing is, as you said at the beginning, this was the largest ground campaign the U.S. Army ever fought in, and it is known by people, who study history, and I think even people on the street would kind of heard of the Battle of the Bulge. But as with so many other subjects, we don't necessarily know the full story. Everyone knows a bit about, as you said, you made the nuts reference. Everyone understands that. Everyone understands that. They know it from the Battle of the Bulge, from Band of Brothers, from everything else. The Battle of the Bulge is a very complicated and large-scale battle that even involves, Montgomery's forces coming in to shoulder some of the responsibilities, as General Daniel Bolger talked about on the channel a couple of years ago. Do you think we have enough understanding of the Battle of the Bulge in all its complexity, or are we a little bit stuck on those kind of famous stories?
There's a lot of untold stories out there, right? And hats off to the 101st Airborne at Bastogne, right? But they have, it's an active duty unit with a full-time public affairs shop. So that's the story you keep hearing at Band of Brothers. But there's so many stories out there, and it was such a large action, right? Their piece of holding the southern shoulder and that crossroads at Bastogne, hugely important, but it was a team effort. I mean, if one of those units had broken and ran, we'd be talking about a different story.
Well, we talked about the 28th Division last year, and although they're portrayed rather negatively as kind of falling back in the TV show Band of Brothers, they did some important stands as well, and even the beleaguered 106th and other units, they did their best before they were overrun. No one was absolutely hopeless in this campaign. These are well-trained soldiers. It was a situation at an overwhelming odds, and the surprise that was the decisive factor in those first 24 hours for the Germans. But I think there is a lot more to this battle to understand. And thank you on behalf of the World War II TV viewers for bringing us another little slice that tells a part of the story. So, to round things off, what are your plans next? You're out of the army now. You've written this book. Are you going to carry on in the writing field? Are you going to do something else? What's your plans?
So this past semester, I was teaching political science at the Paris School of International Affairs, right, just to see if I want to get my foot into academia. And I'd like to write another book, right? Maybe not that Third Army versus Third Armored Division. There's another one that would be interesting to be the unbeatable team of 1st Infantry Division, 3rd Armored Division, and the 9th TAC, right, as the hammer of 7th Corps. And I don't think that's been written. So I just love digging up these stories. And I've met so many family members of Task Force Hogan. And there's so many stories out there that I'd like to continue writing and talking about a subject I love, which is history.
Well, that's a great answer, and it reminds us all there are plenty more stories to research and plenty more people to do that research. So, folks, we will leave things there. Thank you, William. Thank you, viewers, for your questions. I'll be back next week with more shows. But in the meantime, enjoy your weekend, everybody. Don't forget the link to Will's book is in the description as below. Click like and subscribe. Consider becoming a patron. You know the score. But as for me, I will see you all after the weekend. Cheers, everybody. Thanks for watching. Bye.